Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about blood, and I'm just going to go through some of the basic components of it. Now, this video is primarily designed for those in Key Stage 3, but it's also useful for those at Key Stage 4 because some parts of it will go in a little bit more detail. So we're going to look at what blood is actually made up of, how much blood you have in the body, and the structure and function of some of the components of blood. Now, I have done other videos looking in more depth and detail at those specific components individually. For example, I've done one video on white blood cells specifically, but this one is just more of an overview of them all. So let's think about how much blood we actually have. There's our starting point. So we roughly have about, in an average adult, about 5 litres. So we're looking at 5 litres, which equates to about 10 pints. So that's how much blood we have in an average body. And if we were to take all that blood and we're just imagining here, that was all in one test tube. Let's put all of that blood in a single test tube, if that were possible. We're going to see almost 2 distinct sections to that blood. About 45% of our blood, 45%, is cellular. So 45% of our total blood volume is actually made up of blood cells. The other 55% of the blood is made up of a liquid that we refer to as plasma, our blood plasma. Now, plasma is just, as I said, the liquid component of the blood, and in that plasma you find a number of things. You can find water, fibrinogen, albumin, a protein, antibodies, digested foods, mineral salts, vitamins, hormones, but also things like cell waste. So in that we're including urea and carbon dioxide. So all of those are carried or dissolved into that plasma, the liquid part, that 55%. So we're looking now in a bit more detail about the 45%. We're going to look at the type of cells that we see within the blood, and in that are included 3. We'll look at the red blood cells, we'll look at the white blood cells, but also a third type of cell that is often ignored, and that's the platelet. Now, if we just think for a moment about the general functions of the circulatory system, and by that I mean the heart and all of the blood vessels and the blood that it carries, it has a few key functions, and it's important that we acknowledge those key functions before we start to talk about the actual components. Key things that the circulatory system, the blood, must do is carry oxygen to all the cells in the body. We need to carry food to all the cells in the body for respiration. We need to be able to remove waste from the cells of the body, but also around the body distribute heat. And that's one of the jobs of blood. It's able to carry and distribute heat around that body. We also need it to form part of the defence against disease, microbes, and any harmful organisms that could hurt us. And finally, we need the ability to heal and to prevent blood loss by clotting, and that's where the platelets come in. So let's start first of all with the red blood cells. Let's look at those in a bit more detail. Now, I'm going to just draw a sort of rough picture of a red blood cell here, as if you're looking at it from above, and I'm just going to have a sort of darker patch in the middle. I'll explain why I've drawn this sort of central darker patch. See, if you look at a red blood cell, it looks like a biconcave disc. Almost like if you imagine a donut and it's been punched at both the top and the bottom, so it's almost squashed at the top and the bottom. That's almost like what a red blood cell looks like. So that's what we're going to deal with first. We'll look at the red blood cell. Now the red blood cell, the correct name for the red blood cell is the erythrocyte. So we'll put that in there. Red blood cell, their proper names are erythrocytes. And they look a bit like biconcave discs. And the reason why they do is to increase the surface area. They have no nucleus, so we'll put that in there. There's no nucleus within the red blood cell. And their job is to ultimately carry oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. Now, they contain hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. So they contain, and we'll put here, contain, it's called hemoglobin, and that forms oxyhemoglobin when the two combine. Now, red blood cells are the most numerous blood cell. There's about 5 million per microliter of blood. So I'll put that just as a side thing, that they are the most numerous. I'm not going to write everything I say, just a few key bits. And red blood cells make up about 40% of our total blood volume. And that's a measure called the hematocrit. Hematocrit, the hematocrit. It's a measure called the hematocrit that looks at our total blood volume in respect of just that the red blood cells make up. And the red colour is caused by the hemoglobin, which accounts for nearly all of the red cell volume. And to just highlight, because this is the key thing about the red blood cells, the hemoglobin is the critical protein that transports oxygen from our lungs to the tissues. That's their main function. If we look at the white blood cells, I'm just going to draw again just a very rough sketch here. It isn't remotely to scale. Let's just draw something in there. I'll explain what I've drawn in just 2 moments. So let's look at now the white blood cell. Now the white blood cell, the general, if we give the scientific name, is leukocyte. We have a variety of white blood cells in our body, and I've drawn, you can see this big purple patch on the picture I've drawn is a lobed nucleus. So they have very large nuclei. White blood cells are ultimately involved in the protection against infection. They're larger than red blood cells. So we'll make a few key bits here. These are larger than the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. They have no fixed shape. They're not like the red blood cells that have that characteristic biconcave disc. And there's actually less of them. There's less of them than red blood cells. They are the largest of the blood cells, but they are also the fewest. There's about only 5,000 to 10,000 white blood cells per microliter. And there are several different types, but they're all related to immunity and fighting infection. So, as I alluded to earlier, in the separate video we look more in detail about the different lymphocytes that exist and the phagocytes, all white blood cells but do slightly different jobs. So, for that 45% cellular component of blood, we've got red blood cells, we've got the white blood cells. I just want to talk about the platelets. I won't necessarily write all this down, but it's just to make a note that platelets, also called thrombocytes, are the sort of third cellular component of the blood that often people dismiss. They're about 20% of the diameter of red blood cells, so they're quite small, but they're also the most numerous cell type in the blood. Normal platelet count is about 150,000 to 350,000 per microliter of blood. But since platelets are so small, they make up just a tiny fraction of the blood volume. Now, the principal job of these platelets is to prevent bleeding, and they're involved in scab formation. So if you cut yourself and you notice a scab forming after a few days, it's the platelets that are involved in that. They're not actually true cells as such, but they're more circulating fragments of cells. And they contain proteins on their surface that allow them to stick to breaks in the blood vessel wall and also stick to each other. And that helps them in this clotting process. And they also contain granules that can secrete other proteins required for creating this firm plug to seal any blood vessel breaks. Just as an added bonus, platelets also contain proteins similar to muscle proteins that can allow them to change shape when they become sticky. So all of those kind of features are designed for platelets to help form this scab and help prevent, ultimately, bleeding. So you get this nice scab forming, they prevent blood loss. So there we have our main cell components. We've got the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, these biconcave discs, very numerous, no nucleus, contain hemoglobin that when it binds with oxygen forms oxyhemoglobin, carrying oxygen to the tissues that need it. We have the white blood cells, the leucocytes, that are larger than the red but are less abundant. They don't have a fixed shape and they're involved in fighting off infection. We have a very robust system of white blood cells, many different types, phagocytes, lymphocytes, etc. And then we have the platelets, or the thrombocytes as they're called, that are small, more fragments of cells, if you like, and they're involved in preventing blood loss. So that's the cellular component, and as I said again, 55% of our blood is just the liquid component, the plasma, which contains within it everything else that you would expect to find in the blood. So antibodies, digested foods, vitamin, minerals, but also waste. One common mistake I see in exam papers are when we look in the topic of respiration at where the carbon dioxide and oxygen is travelling to and from. And it's important to note that oxygen is carried by the red blood cell. The carbon dioxide is dissolved into the plasma. That's just the key distinction there. So that's a little bit about blood, what it's made up of. We've said how much there is, roughly in an adult about 5 litres, which equates to about 10 pints. And we've looked at the structure and function of some of the components of blood. Okay, hope all that helps.